Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm François Picard. Our guest, Kadi Martin. She's a former journalist for ABC News in America and National Public Radio, and the best-selling author of several books. Her latest book, a bestseller, it's called Paris, a Love Story, and it's born from the grief after the death of Richard Holbrooke, your late husband. He was the mediator for the peace deal in Bosnia, as well as the brokering the peace in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He suffered a heart attack in late 2010. And it is, by many respects, the story that many people have felt is a universal story. But not everybody gets a phone call from the Afghan president, sits next to the Pakistani president at the memorial service, or consoles themselves in the arms of Hillary Clinton.
It's true. It's true. My grief, which was powerful because Richard's death was entirely unexpected and sudden, could not stay private because he was a public man, and the memorials after his death became enormous events at which both President Obama and President Clinton and Secretary General Kofi Annan and Hillary Clinton all spoke. And I spoke as well, because it's not customary for a widow to speak at her husband's funeral. But I decided that death leaves you so helpless that this was something that I could do. And also something more important than that, I wanted to give a different portrait of Richard than the one that the world knew of this bulldozer diplomat who was able to bring the warlords of the Balkans to heel and to get them to sign agreements.
I was going to say, on our debate program, we've had former ministers who were at those Dayton Accord negotiations.
Yes.
The words that came up more were things like bully, belligerent,
of course,
liar.
Yeah, if these warlords would have liked Richard, then Richard would not have been doing his job. But you know, he didn't only bring peace to Bosnia. He also shook up the United Nations when he was ambassador there. He got the U.S. to pay its way long overdue dues. And more importantly, he got the UN to deal with a health issue for the first time at the Security Council level, namely AIDS, which was a direct result of a trip that Richard and I took in 2000, where we went to 11 African countries, and we came face to face with the terrible, catastrophic ravages of AIDS in Africa as it was beginning to pull itself out of its past, and he forced, in typical Holbrookian fashion, he forced the Security Council, against the wishes even of our dear friend Kofi Annan, to deal with AIDS as an international security issue, which has made a tremendous difference in the course of that terrible disease. So that was the Richard that the world knew, the statesman diplomat. But I always thought that the best of Richard was the human being. And so I spoke about that there were 3 memorials, one at the United Nations, one at the Kennedy Center in Washington, and one in Berlin, because he had been ambassador to Germany. And that human being is at the heart of Paris, a Love Story too, which is the story of our love affair, but with Paris as the backdrop, because every good thing in my life seems to, for whatever reason, have happened in Paris. And that's why I'm here now. It's not a book about grief. It's a book about how grief, loss, sooner or later finds all of us. That's part of the human condition. And how do you get past that shock, that grief, to another place? And I'm finding Paris a good place for that, because Paris, a place of such beauty and with so many joyful memories for me.
And there's a bit of destiny as well mixed in. You come to the typical story, the American doing their year abroad. You
Yes.
come to France. You're in the heart of the Latin Quarter. Only it's not just any year. It's the year there were major student riots in France.
Yes,
and
1968.
You have front row seats to May 68
Yes.
in France. And unbeknownst to you, Richard Holbrooke is on the other side of town, the other side of the Seine River,
Yes.
Negotiating the end to the Vietnam War.
Yes, we did not meet. I was then an adolescent in a mini jupe, linking arms with the student revolutionaries, while Richard was sitting with the Vietnamese, the North
You're
Vietnamese.
a bit ambiguous in your book about the revolutionaries. On the one hand,
Yes.
you express your distaste for the French riot police, which still lingers.
Scary they were, yeah.
And on the other hand, you're like, are these students going to keep me from passing my exams?
And something else, Francois. Yes, I was a very determined little girl, but I also had memories of another very bloody revolution when I was a little kid growing up in Budapest, when we had an equally hopeful at the beginning revolution, which ended in violence and blood, and it resulted in my family having to flee Budapest, and that's when we began our long journey to the United States. So I did not share my fellow students' excitement in singing the Internationale, and the thing that shocked me most was when I saw a poster of Stalin in the Latin Quarter, and Stalin had jailed my parents. And I thought, do they even know the cruelty of this man? I can't support a revolution that hails Stalin as an iconic figure. And as you say, mostly I wanted to get on with my exams, and I wanted to get on with my life. I was like a lot of refugee kids. I was poor, and B, ambitious.
So you have front row seats for these student riots that characterized France in the late 60s. You also have front row seats to the Cold War. You're the West Germany correspondent for ABC News, and the London correspondent at the time, who would go on to be the star anchor, Peter Jennings, is there. You fall in love, you have two children, and Paris, again, is the place where you meet.
Yes, I was in those days covering the exile of the Ayatollah Khomeini in a Parisian suburb, Neauphle-le-Château. And it was during that coverage when I was first exposed to the Iranian Revolution, and also when Peter and I had our most explosive love affair, which lasted for 15 years. And 15 years after this great explosion, I fled what was then an unhappy marriage to Paris with my two little kids, and Richard Holbrooke, who in those days was the ambassador to Germany, rode not on a white Charger, but drove his armored ambassadorial car from Bonn to Paris and rescued me. We were friends, casual friends. And I was a mess. I felt my life was behind me. I was 40 years old, two kids, and was leaving a marriage. And Richard, just as a friend, said, "What's your favorite part of France?" And I said, "The Loire Valley." And so off we went 18 years ago, and it was during that trip that we laid the foundation for our new life together.
It's interesting because you're a very promising reporter who, on top of it, gets awards for your coverage of returning to Hungary, to the scene of where you grew up. But all that has to be put a little bit aside when you have children, and Peter is the star anchor, Peter Jennings is the star anchor in New York for ABC News. Do you feel as though the fact that your career had to sort of hit the pause button, that may have also been one of the strains?
I'm actually very grateful that my career hit the pause button when it did, because it forced me to try another way of life, which is writing books. This is my 8th book, and I'm proud to say that they've all done very well. I was also able to spend much more time with my children without giving up who I am, because I was always working on something.
And you describe it well. When you're then the wife of Richard Holbrooke, you realize that being the wife of the UN ambassador and of a peace negotiator, at one point you're seated between Slobodan Milosevic and the head of the Bosnians, and you're entrusted with really important diplomatic tasks.
Yes, Richard said, "Kati, your job is to make them talk to each other." And of course, this was Milosevic and Izbegovic, who 10 days before were trying to kill each other, literally. And for much of that evening, it was the first night at the Dayton Peace Conference, they wouldn't even look in each other's direction. So kind of in despair, I said, how did this war start? You know, very naively. And that got them engaged. And by the end of that conversation, they were calling each other Slobodan and Alia. So I felt like I had succeeded. But Richard used me whenever Richard would use any tool available to achieve his chosen end. And for example, when we were at the United Nations, he always had me give the welcoming toast, because we entertained everybody from Nelson Mandela to President Chirac in our residence at the Waldorf Towers. And he, contrary to UN custom, I always gave the welcoming toast, because Richard felt that I always spoke from the heart, and yet with, if I may say, a little bit of intelligence. And I used to work very hard on those toasts to make them witty and to try to, you know, so yes, I played amateur diplomat.
All right, and it did much more than break the ice, it seems. And the fact that you and him picked out that Parisian apartment is our good fortune, because you're with us today.
Thank you.
In the studio. I want to thank you very much, Kadi Martin, for being with us. Again, the name of the book is Paris, A Love Story. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 interview. Stay with us, more to come.